I'm Alice Mong, Asia Society's Hong Kong Center Executive Director. I'm delighted so many of you here here tonight to hear a wonderful talk by Professor Jonathan Glover, Professor of Ethics, King's College London. And the topic of tonight's talk is going to be, can humanity leave war behind us? And I think this is our second talk of today. We had, prior to this, we had Doug Paul from Carnegie talking about the impact of the U.S. elections. It's only been 9 days since the U.S. election, and as a Chinese American, we are still kind of sorting out what's going on, and all of us, I think, will be sorting out what's happening in the United States for months to come. And I'm particularly interested in Professor Glover's talk tonight, and unfortunately I have another commitment, but I'm going to turn it over tonight's program to somebody who really brought this program to us and made this program possible, and that's Edgar Chen. Edgar, thank you, and also Professor Hong Lam Lee, CUHK Center for Bioethics, and we have cooperated, and also Edith, thank you. We have cooperated with the Bioethics Center before, and we look forward to future cooperations. Topics like this, and I'm so glad to see so many students with us, and as well as our members. It shouldn't be just in the classrooms, and it shouldn't be just to one university. And this is where Asia Society Hong Kong Center does its role, does its best, when we can bridge, when we can have discussion, and when we can look at the big picture. I know, I think, having come back from the States, I went home to vote. I voted in Virginia, and then I came back and then watched the results, and look at the recent conflicts and around the world. It's not just in the United States or elections. What's going on in Hong Kong. There's so many things happening around the world that I feel kind of helpless. And after today's talk, earlier talk, and now I know tonight's talk will be very inspirational by somebody who knows the topic and really kind of give us more food for thought. It's not the end of the world. And I've decided after Monday this week, it's not the end of the world. There's still so much to look forward to. There's humanity in this world. And we have a lot. And so to see so many young faces really inspires me to, and the kind of organization that we are, and as an educational organization. And that's why the cooperations with all the universities here in Hong Kong and also with global institutions is what we do best. So this is why thank you for bringing this program with us. And I want to, at this time, invite Professor Lee to come up and formally introduce our speaker and get the program started. And I look forward to have Professor Glover back anytime. Hong Kong is really an interesting time, but also the world is interesting time. I want to point out, we had a political debate in this room a few weeks ago, and we have two bobbleheads sitting there. So if you're seeing the bobbleheads, it's no accident. We had both the Clinton and the Trump bobbleheads. And so we were anticipating what's going on in the United States. So I think let the dialogue, let the discussion continue, and welcome to Asia Society. And Professor Lee, thank you.
It's a real treat to have Professor Jonathan Glover tonight. Professor Glover is a leading philosopher who specializes in practical ethics. Prior to becoming Professor of Ethics at King's College London in 1998, he was already a famous world-class philosopher teaching at Oxford University. He has written 7 books. His first book, Responsibility, was a major contribution to the literature on free will and responsibility. His second book, Causing Death and Saving Life, is now a classic. It was the first book-length philosophical treatment on the ethics of killing, including diverse topics such as abortion, euthanasia, the death penalty, and the ethics of war. What Sort of People Should There Be, published in 1984, was the first philosophical book ever written on the ethics of genetic choices, and in its second half, the first book on what is now called neuroethics. Choosing Children, Genes, Disability, and Design, published in 2006, descended from his inaugural Uhiro lecture in practical ethics delivered at Oxford University. Besides practical ethics, Professor Glover is an expert in philosophy of mind, psychology, and psychiatry. He has written the book entitled I, the Philosophy and Psychology of Personal Identity, and also a recent book, Alien Landscape, Interpreting Disordered Mind. His widely acclaimed book, Humanity, is a moral history of the 20th century. He chaired a European Commission working party on assisted reproduction. The Glover Report was published in 1989. His works have been translated into various foreign languages, including French, Finnish, Italian, Japanese, Korean, Norwegian, and Spanish. Without further ado, let's welcome Professor Glover.
Well, thank you for that generous introduction. I should say that I feel that if this is the second lecture you've heard today, this one is going to be rather eclipsed by the previous one, as I can't possibly claim that my topic has the gloriously surreal qualities of the recent American election. But I think it's my topic, I hope, is still a highly relevant one. I start with the thought that in 1945, the United Nations Charter started with the words, "We, the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war." And one only has to think about the current news, the appalling nightmare of what's going on in Syria, to want to ask some questions about why the world order that was supposed to be being designed in 1945, 70 years later, has so spectacularly failed to rid humanity from the scourge of war. Now, one view is that war is something very deep in human nature, possibly biologically programmed into us from an earlier stage of humanity's participation in the Darwinian struggle for survival. Well, not just humanity's struggle, but also the struggle of different human groups against each other, as well as against other predators and so on. There's a rather striking account an anthropologist gave, which is if an anthropologist studying in New Guinea. He gave an account of giving a helicopter ride to one of 2 or 3 of the people in the tribe he was studying. This is reported by Frans de Waal, the Dutch-American expert on primate species other than ourselves. And the anthropologist said that they offered a ride back to the village in the helicopter. The tribesmen had never been never flown before. And they said, yes, they'd really like that. And they got in. They were wearing nothing but their penis sheaths. But they said, please keep the window open, although it was rather cold, and they were a bit puzzled by this. And then they said, we just have to collect some stuff. And they brought it onto the helicopter, a whole lot of rocks. And it turned out that what they planned, they said, now please fly over, not to our village straight away. There's a village over there of people we don't much like. And the anthropologist said, I felt as though I had been present at the invention of bombing by Neolithic man. Now, I think it's quite plausible that probably many of our tendencies towards war are, in that sense, deeply programmed into us. It's hard to know exactly how far. And it's even when things are biologically programmed, there's always the hope of being able to change things, change actual behavior by environmental means. But so what I want to do is talk a bit about I'll mention the varieties of war. There are so many different kinds of war going on. There's conflict over resources or for land. There's ideological war between people who have different systems of belief, whether political or religious or both. And then there's tribal war, where people just don't much like each other and feel aggressive towards each other, and wars keep breaking out. Now, I'm going to talk particularly about tribal war because the subject of war is so huge. I've got half an hour in which to speak, and I couldn't possibly even pretend to scratch the surface of the various different kinds of war. But I want to take one, tribal war. By tribal, I don't mean to be dismissive. I don't want to sound like some British colonial official of 50 years ago. The natives are very good here, really. They're quite decent people, provided you would give them orders and tell them what to do. Well, I don't want to do that. But when I use the word tribes, I mean groups of people. They may be different nation states, or they may be groups of people holding different religious views, Sunni and Shiite, or whatever it may be, who feel a strong sense that their own identity is bound up with a particular group membership, but also have deep clashes with other similar groups. I want to include, for instance, Israel and Palestine as two tribes, without meaning to be in any sense dismissive of either Israelis or Palestinians in calling it tribal. It's not so long ago that our slightly ludicrous recent vote is probably eclipsed by what's gone on in the United States, but it's not so long ago that a pretty tribal vote took place in the United Kingdom about how we'd really rather run ourselves and not have to have quite so much to do with European neighbours. The two things I want to concentrate on in thinking about the causes of tribal war are two kinds of traps. I'm going to call them the trap of mutual fear, and then what I'll call the cycle of violence and backlash. Now, on the trap of mutual fear, this goes back. The earliest record that I know, though no doubt it was going on before, comes in Thucydides' account of the history of the Peloponnesian War. We're talking about the origins of that war. He says, he mentions all sorts of factors, but he says what made war inevitable was the growth of Athenian power and the fear this caused in Sparta. In other words, if you have a neighbor that you're not quite sure how well you get on with them, or even worse relations than that, it's a bit frightening if they suddenly start pushing up their military very powerfully and so on. And it's interesting that in the English Civil War in the 17th century, Thomas Hobbes, the philosopher, writing after his experience of the outbreak of the English Civil War, and also as the first English translator of Thucydides, he invented the idea of the state of nature in which it's natural for us to be at war, because if you have things that I would like to have, I have a motive for attacking you. If I have things that you would like to have, you have a motive for attacking me. But it's more complex than that, because each of us sees that the other person, the other side, has a motive for attacking us. And as a result, there's a strong incentive towards preemptive attack. And that, in turn, the cycle, you can see, just goes up in a rather alarming way. Mutual threats together with preemptive strikes. Now, that's the first trap I want to suggest we fall into, that even if people would really rather not have war, there are often pressures of this kind to go to war, to either take someone else's stuff, but more often perhaps to stop them taking your stuff, or to stop them for attacking you because they fear you. Now I want to talk at greater length about what I call the cycle of tribal violence, of wars, people being defeated in war, and then there being a backlash which leads to the next round of conflict. For instance, I'm really struck that in the 1990s, when after the collapse of Yugoslavia, the people in Serbia, Croatia, Montenegro, all the different parts of what had once been Yugoslavia, the hostilities started to re-emerge. And much of the rhetoric on all sides was about defeats their side had suffered at the hands of people in the other groups. It's very striking that, for instance, when Milosevic made a passionate nationalist speech, he referred to the shame and disgrace that had been inflicted on the Serbs by the Turks at a thing called the Battle of the Field of Blackbirds in the year 1389. So memories last about these things, resentments fester, and people want to hit back. In the Yugoslavia, it's very clear that people in Serbia remembered the fascist period in Croatia. People in Croatia remembered the dominance under Tito of Serbia. And there were resentments about killings, massacres, all sorts of discrimination and so on that had taken place in these different periods. I want to take as a central case of this, though, this idea of defeat followed by backlash and so another round of war. I want to take the case of Germany and France in the 19th century and in the 20th century up to 1945. The great German nationalist document, which was as well the original theoretical basis of German nationalism, was given by the philosopher Gottlob Fichte, which was originally given as, it was called Addresses to the German People. And it was given as a series of lectures in Berlin in 1807, at which time Napoleon's armies had defeated Germany. Berlin was occupied by French troops, and so there was a huge receptiveness for the idea that Germans ought to unite and be national and assert themselves and avenge the defeat. So in 1870, Bismarck triggered a war with France, the Franco-Prussian War, and then the Prussians defeated France very solidly. Bismarck triggered the war at a time when Germany was really pretty powerful relative to France militarily. As a result, Germany occupied 1/3 of France. And also they had a victory march through the Champs-Élysées, which was a humiliation for the French people. And also they took over the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine. And as a result, the French had strong resentment against Germany. And so they were part of building up alliances which were meant to guard against Germany doing the attack again. But in fact, Germans perceived it as encirclement. The alliance between France and Russia was seen as a threat. So that, for instance, the German Chancellor at the time, Bethmann Hollweg, he was planting some trees on his estate, not far from Berlin, and he said, I don't really know why I'm doing this, because it's not so long till the Russians will attack and they'll be here. These trees won't last. As a result of the 1914-18 war, the Versailles Treaty, Maynard Keynes, the economist, was there as a British diplomat and reported on a lot of what went on. And he described how the French, under Clemenceau, their prime minister, or do I mean presidents? I'm showing I'm not a real historian, not quite remembering whether he was prime minister or president. But Clemenceau, who was the leading person, was the most intransigent. I mean, there were a lot of Germans were dying as a result of the Allied naval blockade, which went on until the final peace treaty was signed. And the British and the Americans particularly wanted to send food and money to relieve the suffering that was going on in Germany, and Clemenceau was adamant against it. He was the most vigorous in demanding reparations from Germany, and he was one of the great movers of the demand that Germany should have to accept the total guilt for the starting of the First World War. He made them sign things called the war guilt clauses. Now, after that, and my next stop in this brief sort of trip around this depressing cycle, the next, I don't know if any of you have ever seen the film of the Nazi rallies made by Leni Riefenstahl called Triumph of the Will. A brilliant piece of filmmaking in an extraordinarily evil cause. But that film starts, and one of the things about it is propaganda films, so as it were, the really darkest bits of Nazism, the hatred of the Jews, the plans for extermination and so on, that was kept very much in the background. But what gave it huge popular appeal, this film, and gave the Nazi, in the Nazi riots, gave huge popular appeal, what gave them the appeal was that they wanted to have German renewal after the humiliation of the defeat in 1918 and the things imposed on them by Versailles. And as a result, this passionate resentment that Hitler felt was also felt by many people in Germany, and he got huge support. And the final bit of the downward spiral is that after Hitler defeated France, he was a brilliant stage manager, Hitler, really. I mean, he took over the coach, the railway coach, in the town of Compiègne, where the 1918 armistice had signed after the German surrender, and forced the French. He sat where Marshal Foch had sat, and forced the French humiliatingly to come and sign abjectly the new peace terms. Now, one of the slightly encouraging things is that in 1945, after the Allies had won, some lessons had been learnt from history. Because instead of demanding lots of reparations from Germany, instead of demanding they sign things about their guilt and so on, what actually happened was the Marshall Plan to help set up the whole of Europe, including Germany, and for instance, the Saarland, which was a disputed territory, was allowed to decide by plebiscite whether they wanted to be part of France or Germany, and they nearly unanimously, as they were nearly all German speakers, voted for Germany, and that was fine. So sometimes lessons are learnt. Rather similar cycle of this kind in the 9/11 and the War on Terror. Bin Laden talked about the humiliations of having Americans invading, by which he meant they had troops there, the Holy Land for Muslims. And he said that they should be humiliated in turn. And he said that their armies should leave all the territory of Islam defeated, broken, and unable to threaten any Muslim. It's the phrase defeated and broken which captures the retaliation for humiliation which he felt. Then, of course, after 9/11, the United States hugely felt humiliated by the disaster. And so George Bush, talking to a crowd in the ruins of the World Trade Center, said, "I can hear you, the rest of the world hears you, and the people who knocked these buildings down will hear us all soon." And as we know, he then arranged an invasion of a country which actually wasn't to do, the invasion of Iraq, a country that wasn't actually to do with 9/11 at all. Now, in the long run, it seems to me that if we hope that we can escape the scourge of war, as the United Nations Charter wanted us to. In the long run, we need some way of policing the world, which doesn't involve one country dominating and other people feeling humiliated. I mean, it was a miracle that in 1945 the peace settlement was as it was. So often it hasn't been. And I go to the hugely distinguished German philosopher Immanuel Kant, who's talking about, he was actually replying to Hobbes several hundred years later, said, because Hobbes thought the only way of keeping the peace is to have one all-powerful king who is so powerful that no one will dare to make war. And that's worth it because of the horror and suffering of war. And in the international arena, the Hobbesian solution is to have one power that's so strong that nobody dares stand up to them. And in recent times, that's, a long time ago it was Rome, 150 years ago it was Britain, more recently it's been the United States. Now we're in the interesting situation where a country close to Hong Kong possibly may be the next power that has the ability to do this. But the problem with that is that it's always, it seems, that it's one country imposing things on other countries, which leads to the sense of humiliation. And if we want to find ways of keeping the peace that don't involve this sense of humiliation, then I believe we have to look for some kind of international solution. Kant thought there ought to be a federation. He saw that people didn't want a world government. People wanted their own nation states, but he thought they ought to cede a monopoly of military force to a world federation, which they were all part of. And in a way, the United Nations, as it was planned in 1945, was meant to be that. But one of the problems is that it's very difficult when some countries are strong. It's very difficult to persuade them to give up power. I think Britain has long ceded power, and so people in Britain might be relatively happy to have a very strong United Nations. The United States hasn't, because they've got the power, and why cede it to the UN? Maybe when China becomes more powerful, if it does, the US will suddenly change its mind, but by that time maybe China will think differently. So I think it's very hard to see the ideal solution coming into power at the moment, and we need to do a lot of thinking about how we can have something like the American Constitution with its relations of different states where they have a degree of autonomy, but at the same time there's a monopoly of force in the federal government. It's very difficult to work out how it would work, and it's also likely to be hugely difficult to implement it. So what then can we do, short of the reform of the world system, which I believe is needed, but brings with it huge problems of its own? I think we ought to then think of things which aren't just massive political reforms, but think about educational projects. And one of the things is, for instance, that there is an intellectual illusion that is involved in this cycle of violence and retaliation. And that is the illusion of collective responsibility. They, the other country, did this to us, so we will smash back and hit them. This is clearly found in the leaders. Bin Laden, for instance, celebrated 9/11 as rubbing the nose of America in the dirt. But is it likely that of the around 3,000 people he killed, all of them supported interventions by America in the Muslim world? What of Muslim Americans? What of the 86 people he killed who came from Japan, Colombia, Jamaica, Mexico, and the Philippines? Equally, I think President Bush saying that the people who knocked these buildings down will hear from us all soon. But one wonders how many of the thousands of Afghan civilians killed actually fit this description of the people who knocked this down. And was it true of any of the perhaps 600,000 or more Iraqis who were killed. Then it isn't just leaders, it's also supporters. For instance, after the part of the Muslim backlash against the Iraq war was the bombing in London, what we call the 7/7 bombings, in 2005, July the 7th, 2005, where they bombed the London Underground system and bombed the bus system. Mohammed Sadiq Khan made a videotaped message before he was acted as a suicide bomber. And he said he was both British and Muslim, but it's clear that his chosen identity was Muslim rather than British. What he said was, your democratically elected governments continuously perpetrate atrocities against my people all over the world, and your support of them makes you directly responsible. Until we feel security, you will be our targets. Until you stop the bombing, gassing, imprisonment and torture of my people, we will not stop this fight. We are at war and I am a soldier. Now you too will taste the reality of this situation. And again, the question I want to ask about that is, with his bomb on the Edgware Road station in London, Mohammed Sadiq Khan killed, apart from himself, 6 people. One question he might have asked is whether some of his potential victims might have been British and Muslim. I mean, in fact, Vivette and I go shopping in the Edgware Road from time to time, and it's absolutely full of Middle Eastern shops selling Middle Eastern food. And I think there's probably, quite likely a Muslim majority in that area. He might also have asked whether some of the people he killed might have been at the demonstration against the Iraq War in London, which was London's largest political demonstration in the whole of history. I should be finishing soon, I think, so I just want to go and mention one second project, thank you. One second project, which might be, given that we certainly aren't immediately going to set up the World Federation, I wish we were in some ways, not entirely, but I wish we were in some ways. We're not going to do that immediately or for the foreseeable future. What other projects can we do to... I mentioned the UN Charter at the beginning. The UNESCO Charter, United Nations Educational, Social and Cultural Organization, it starts with the phrase, wars are made in the minds of men. And just as I think work of an educational kind in exposing the illusions behind collective responsibility. All Muslims are responsible for 9/11. All Americans are responsible for whatever's done in the Muslim world. Another thing which I think is worth doing is trying to get people to understand the narratives of the conflict on the other side. I have a fantasy, I wish somebody would do this. I'm not a filmmaker and I can't, but I think what's needed is something like, say if you take the Israel-Palestine conflict, each side has its own story. Each side talks about the atrocities the other side has perpetrated on them. They took our land. No, but it was ours further back. They have killed us in these horrible suicide bombings. No, but they are killing us, and so on. And I think there's a case for doing experiments of the kind I'm just about to describe. I'd want to get 2 teams of expert filmmakers, one from Israel, one from Palestine, and I'd want to say to them, please make a film, each of you, the Israelis on one side, the Palestinians on the other, 2 films, each one a powerful propaganda film about your own side story. Pull no punches. If you interview people whose children were killed by suicide bombers on the school bus, interview people whose houses have been demolished by Israeli soldiers, and so on. Make the most powerful emotional statement. The only constraint being, don't tell factual lies. And then, when they've done that, if they do, there are all sorts of hitches in the way of this project, but this is something which I would like to see people try. After they've each made their films, then have a conference where both sides meet and discuss. They could first discuss the problems of making such a film, filmmakers' technical problems, where they might have something in common. Then they could discuss, these films are very different, you've seen each other's films. Would it be possible to produce a film which showed an objective account, showed the truth, the film that God might have made, or, since I'm not a religious believer, the film that Tolstoy might have made, where he had the ability to kind of look inside people on all sides. And they could discuss that, whether objectivity is possible. And then the next thing to ask them is, please go away together and see if between you can make a film which does justice to both sides. That's just a suggestion. Also, they probably, some of them would refuse to collaborate with the others. There'd be fights break out between them, perhaps, and so on. But I think we ought to be much more creative. War is such a horrendous thing. The nightmare of what's going on in Aleppo. We ought to be much more creative in thinking about educational methods of exposing the psychology, the false beliefs, the assumptions, and so on, and to try to make people think that war is something we really ought to be moving away from much more purposefully than we have since 1945. I hope I haven't too much overrun. I'll stop there.
Now is the time for Q&A. Please.
Could you talk about the solution to the Sunni-Shia problem and the fact that neither are nation states and neither group likes one another, and short of wiping out one, what's the solution?
I wish I knew. It's a conflict of belief. The only thing I can say is that I agree it's not between nations, but that many of the conflicts in the modern world aren't between nations, they're between subgroups within, indeed, yes. But what I would say is this, that what the Sunnis and Shias are doing is not so very different from what Protestants and Catholics did in Europe in the 17th century. And one of the things where I feel we've been a bit let down by historians is that although I've tried to read about what it was that led to the fading away of the violent conflict between Catholics and Protestants, more or less everywhere except Northern Ireland until recently. But that wasn't, of course, just a religious conflict. It was also partly a tribal conflict. I would like to know what it was that led to the fading away of that, and so we could apply it to this. I can't answer your question, partly through my own ignorance, no doubt, but partly through what I feel are deficiencies of the historians who might have told us.
The politicians who set it up.
Yeah, okay, yes.
Yeah, yes, please.
Thank you. Great lecture, by the way. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Do you think that the fact that many of today's wars are what would be considered asymmetric rather than contained wars make the potential solutions an order of magnitude that's even more difficult to approach?
By asymmetric, do you mean...
I mean, there's no defined enemy.
Oh, I see.
In other words,
I thought you might mean imbalance of power. Sometimes...
Well, that too.
That too.
That too. But if you look at the history of more recent warfare, like
Yes.
Vietnam, for example, where there were so-called North Vietnamese regulars who wore uniforms
Yes.
and were clearly identifiable, and then there were the guerrillas who were dressed as civilians, etc. But the force on the other side, whether it was the Americans and before them the French, all wore uniforms.
Yeah.
It was all clearly defined, presented a degree of difficulty that bore tragic results, as we've seen in today's wars. Iraq, Afghanistan, etc., are very much the same. So I'm just wondering whether that asymmetric structure makes things even more complicated and more difficult to bring solutions to.
I think it probably does, but I don't think we ought to regard it as impossible to solve those things. I mean, for instance, the conflict in Northern Ireland was between, on the ground, British uniformed troops on the one hand and Irish Republican Army, although they call themselves an army, they weren't wearing uniform. It was almost impossible to know their command structure and who was in it and so on. And yet, somehow, through clever diplomacy, partly through perhaps war weariness, I wouldn't want to say that the thing has been totally solved, because there are still some groups who plan violence, but it's been hugely contained. And, for me, it was a delight for a number of years that the leaders on both sides, the formidable Protestant clergyman, the Reverend Ian Paisley, and people like Jerry Adams and Mike McGuinness on the other side, were seen laughing and joking together. One thing which I should say, which I think did also help to contribute to the Irish solution, and there are many, many ingredients of what caused the problem and what caused the solution, many of them going back into history and the causes. But one thing was that as part of the European Union, Northern Ireland, as part of the United Kingdom, was part of the European Union, and these politicians had to travel in the plane together and work out a negotiating position with the EU for getting money to fund their things rather than others. So it's one of the many reasons why I regard the recent tribal spasm in my own country as regrettable, because it means that kind of thing is no longer present.
Okay, good. No, okay, yeah, this gentleman.
Hi. I thought the lecture was great. Thank you for that. I just wanted to raise the point that you had discussed about like Muslims and the backlash against Americans, right? I think when we talk about this, we need to also consider the concept of power and the fact that the United States of America has a lot more power than, I guess, like a Muslim within Iraq would or a Muslim within Afghanistan would, right? And I think in terms of that, when there are gross injustices that are done to those that are oppressed, to those that are marginalized, to those that are discriminated against, but the political rhetoric, the common, like the Western rhetoric, the political commonplace rhetoric, general rhetoric, whatever, does not take those people's stories into account. So how are they supposed to be recognized? How do they ask for recognition, to ask for legitimacy if the voices aren't heard, if not by violent means? Because violence is a form of, showing their struggle.
That's a very interesting question, and as with a number of the questions, I certainly can't give a definite authoritative answer which will convince everybody. But I think one thing I agree with you that there are many oppressed people in the world who do very badly out of things, yet many of them don't take to violence. There are hordes of people all over Africa who have an incredible low standard of living, but don't attack America or Europe, the Western capitalists who are doing relatively well out of it. I should say, just as a kind of an aside, in our family, we all voted against Brexit, except our splendid grandson, who voted for Brexit. And he voted for Brexit for utterly different reasons from those which the main campaigners for that thing voted for. He thought it was a disgrace that we were part of a Europe that set up tariff barriers against people in the poorest countries of the world, including Africa. And although I carried on voting for Remain, I hugely respected that point of view. But I think it's an interesting question. Why do some people move to violence when they're oppressed and others don't? And I think it's not obvious that it's just poverty. As it were, the Marxist picture about workers will be increasingly impoverished and so will rise up and rebel and have the socialist revolution. I don't find that very convincing. I think it's much more often when people feel their national identity is insulted and that kind of thing. And I think, for instance, why do Palestinians feel so bad? Well, they feel that was our land, and the Israelis have taken it, and then what's more, they've occupied, it should be said that the war that led to the Israeli occupation was started by the Palestinians at that stage. But it's, as it were, humiliation, it's defeat, it's the feeling of injustice rather than simply poverty. And I want the world to be a more just and equal place, but it's not easy to bring it about, and I'm not sure that's the whole story.
Yes, please.
Thank you. You've been through a number of causes of war, but how about one that appears to me is war as a displacement activity, where you've got somebody like Putin who sees his economy going down the tubes. Therefore, he says he takes everybody's attention away by claiming them as an enemy and then attacking them. So that's very difficult to deal with, or maybe you have an idea because of the bits it's used by politicians.
I certainly agree that I think it's very plausible to say that some wars are indeed engineered by governments to distract attention from other things. What one can do about it, is a lecturer allowed to say, I don't know. I mean, people could be educated more, but one of the things which worries me, I mean, for instance, looking at the recent American election, also at the recent British referendum on the European Union, I'm appalled, really, at how polluted the sources of information often are for the public. I mean, we in Britain are lucky to have the BBC, which maybe there's no such thing as absolute objectivity, but at least tries to be objective. But people reading newspapers, and much of what's on the internet, doesn't even try to be objective. And, well, we all see the American election recently, and the Fox News, how can people whose main source of information is something like Fox News how can they avoid being deceived by governments who want to use war for this sort of thing?
Yvonne? And then...
Thanks for a very interesting lecture. I wanted to ask you about the ways in which people conceive of identity. One of the ways in which you can reduce conflict is by expanding the boundaries of your community, and so the individuals see an affinity and identify with others, who are very different. And there have been a bunch of experiments that have shown that this has some effect, right? But every time you have a boundary, no matter how broad it is, it does create outsiders, just by definition. And there seems to be a limit to how much affinity people can feel for others who are ostensibly on the surface very different from them. And we're seeing this with this backlash against multiculturalism, in a lot of societies. So I'm wondering whether there is a limit. I mean, you also work on bioethics, and I'm wondering whether there's a limit in the human mind and in human emotions to how far you can expand this boundary. We've already pushed it far beyond what many people would have thought was possible. But have we reached a limit, or is there some way to further expand the capacity for human identity, for broadening human identities?
Well, it's such a complex set of issues, really. Some countries manage to have borders with other countries and actually get on quite well. I think, for example, the countries of Scandinavia. In the 17th century, the Swedes had the reputation the Germans had in the 20th as being the warlike people. And somehow they've grown out of that, and they have boundaries, but they don't have hostilities, or not in general, not very much. I mean, there's so many different questions one needs to ask about why people feel this way about other people, because that will affect what we think is the best strategy or set of strategies for reducing it. I mean, one of the things I feel is there's some of the experiments in social psychology. I mean, for instance, the Stanford prison experiment. Do all of you know the Stanford? How many people know the Stanford prison experiment, please? That's nearly all of you, but not quite. So I will, if I may just briefly outline it. It was two college students were the people who participated in the experiment, and they were asked to role play. And they were one lot was to play the role of prisoners in a jail, and the other lot were to play the role of guards in a jail. And they knew how they were allocated. It was done like this: prisoner, guard, prisoner, guard, prisoner, guard. And so they knew that there was nothing genuinely special. It wasn't like people can say, oh, well, they're a different lot from us, they have a different religion or whatever, or they're richer than us, or anything like that. Their politics are different. They were obviously randomly assigned. But they had to role play, and the experiment had to be terminated because people the guards behaved with such disgusting brutality to the prisoners. Now, I believe that if that was widely, obviously it's pretty widely known because most of you put up your hands for that, but as it were, children at school could usefully be taught that. Children at school could be taught that this is the irrational part of our conflict and the other. There are also things like, one of the things I had hoped was that globalization with more travel might mean that we understood that people in far corners of the globe, those of us in Britain, can learn that people in Hong Kong are not really so very different from us. You lot are human just as we are. I think that travel might do that, but obviously it doesn't always work. There are myths put about. We once had a babysitter who came from Northern Ireland in the middle of the worst phase of the conflict. And so when I drove her home after she'd done babysitting for us, I asked her about the conflict. And she said she was a university student in Northern Ireland, and that what they did was the students didn't want their student life to be deformed by the horrible conflict. And so at first they wouldn't ever say what their religion was, or whether they're Protestant or Catholic or nationalist or unionist. And she said that later, when they really knew each other and could trust each other, then it would come out. It wasn't totally secure because sometimes in Northern Ireland you can tell by names. They can indicate somebody's a Catholic or Protestant. But when they got to trust each other, what they then did was they talked about the myths they had been taught about the other side. And interestingly, this young woman who was our babysitter said that when she had been a child, she was taught that the other, and I now can't remember which side her family were on, they'd been taught that the other side are primitive barbaric people who, whereas we have two eyebrows, they just have one eyebrow with no gap in between, and this is a sign of disgusting ape-like primitivity. And she said that when she talked to her student friends on the other side, they had been taught exactly the same thing about her side. Now, I think the more that kind of thing gets known, we can do a little bit to weaken it. But none of these things is a magic. I've come with this bundle of problems, and you're all asking me, okay, you've given us these problems, what should we do about it? Vivette, my wife, who's sitting here, often says that I may be okay as a teacher of philosophy when it comes to actually doing anything in real life. I dither hopelessly, and I'm afraid I do a bit. I still think it's worth asking you to think you may do better than I can.
This gentleman.
I want to go back to your test case where you were talking about the Germans and the French and Bismarck and World War I and World War II.
Yeah.
The Germans and the French don't look like they're going to go to war at any time soon. Can we learn anything from what happened there?
Yeah, well, I think we can, yes. Firstly, that 1945 was not a punitive peace settlement on the Germans. They did very badly because the Russians occupied part of their country, and it was a divided country. But as far as the West was concerned, and actually the East Germans used to complain that the Russians took lots of stuff from them. But as far as the West was concerned, America particularly, the United States, built up the German economy again. So now they're a much more powerful economic unit than any other country in Europe. And that was partly because of the Marshall Plan and things like that. It's also, I believe, and here if I was speaking in Britain, this would be thought highly controversial. It's also, I believe, because people got used to working together in the European Union, got used to thinking of themselves in a way we, in our country, sadly never quite did. People got, in France and Germany, people, especially Germany, partly because Germany has such a nightmare history, that one way of escaping from that is to have your identity as a European rather than as a German, which many Germans do choose. But I mean, that, I think, builds up part of it. Partly it's that the one consequence of the European Union, but not just of that, of modern developments in economics and technology, is that industry is so internationalized in Europe that it would be quite difficult to set up a war between France and Germany because, you know, the equipment for the tanks on one side be made on the other and so on. So that even if you don't believe in the ideals of the European Union, I have to say I share many of the criticisms as profoundly undemocratic in all sorts of ways, but there are still reasons why the setup in the post-war period has favoured not going to war.
Yes, please.
Increasingly, we see wars not fought for resources, but out of ideological or even religious conflicts. Do you think religion can be used as a tool to foster peace and to avoid war? Or do you think religion will always be used as a tool that will foment conflicts between different ideologies?
My friend Richard Dawkins would hate me for saying this, but actually I think, and I agree with Richard Dawkins that often religions cause conflict and war, crusades and all the rest of it, but I think also deep religious commitment can lead to a more humane outlook. The example I would give is in the period after the apartheid regime in South Africa, I think that Archbishop Tutu led the what's called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and he, out of his deep Christian principles, he actually, what they did was they had the ANC, the African National Congress, had won. The other side had been defeated. The other side were racist. They were freedom fighters, or whatever you like. But actually, they insisted that in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the whole truth was told as far as they could get it. So they condemned atrocities on their own side as well. If I just say one thing about this is, I'm afraid, just anecdote, but there was a Church of England priest called Trevor Huddleston, Father Trevor Huddleston, who was in South Africa during the worst period of the racist regime. And Archbishop Tutu was a little boy, and his mother was a cleaner in some building. And she had always, white people in the racist South Africa just walked past. She had not the slightest recognition of her. They treated her as though she was a nobody. And Trevor Huddleston walked through that building, saw her. He was wearing some church hat, or some ecclesiastical hat, and he took it off and nodded to her and smiled. And Tutu was astonished by this because no white man had done this before. And when Trevor Huddleston died, Archbishop Tutu wrote an obituary of him in which he said that he thought that this thing in his childhood had actually made a huge difference because he couldn't see all white people as enemies, despite the fact that it was a white-dominated regime that was doing so much harm to his own people. So it's mixed, is what I want to say. It depends partly what bit of what religion. You know, Sunnis and Shias aren't exactly good advertisement for keeping the peace. Some people say Buddhists are, and we're in a region, Yvette and I have just been going to various Buddhist buildings here and been impressed by the atmosphere of peace and beauty and thinking that maybe Buddhism, at least I've been thinking, I think Yvette has too, maybe Buddhism would be one of the best religions to propagate.
Perhaps the last question.
Not necessarily Sri Lanka.
No, okay, I agree.
My actual question was, where do you put India and Pakistan in your spectre of different wars?
Yes. How I wish I had the huge resources of factual knowledge that I need to answer all these questions. Well, I can see little difference in wickedness between the aggressive religious groups on either side. I know that, for instance, the distinguished Indian economist Amartya Sen is hugely critical of some of the Indian nationalist versions of religion. It's obvious that there are huge on the Muslim side in Pakistan. I can't help thinking that I believe it's fairly generally accepted that when Britain handed over power in 1947, they made a bit of a mess of it. I know that I sometimes talk to Israelis and Palestinians about the handover from the British Mandate, and they always assure me that I should be personally responsible for quite a lot of the mess that was left, because the British made such a mess of things. It gives me a chance, though, to say, when in the Israel-Palestine conflict, when it turns out that both sides say, actually, God promised the land to us, I say, well, the British double-crossed you both, maybe God did too. But in India and Pakistan, I think there was a mess, there was huge bloodshed at the time, and who knows, if it had been more gently handled, it might have been less bad. But I don't really know the answer. Sorry? Churchill won the 1945 election. Well, no, but then they would have both ended up fighting the British.
I think that was the final question. And before we finish, two things are in order. First of all, on behalf of Future Society, I'd like to present this gift or souvenir to Professor Glover.
Oh, thank you very much, and thank you for sharing. Thank you.
And
I shall look forward to this. Read it very much well.
And secondly and finally, thank you very much all for coming here. And if I may just make one announcement, and I was told that I may, there will be the inaugural Lansing lecture in bioethics to be given by Professor Jonathan Glover at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, free admission at 2:30 on Saturday. That's 2 days from now. So if you want to register, registration is a requirement. Even though if you show up properly, you can get admission. But I think it's advisable, because we already have over 300 people registered for the event. The hall is more than 400 people. Has that capacity for more than 475 people. The title of the talk, okay, thank you very much, is called Two Concepts of Dignity. And I believe Professor Glover will do for bioethics what Isaiah Berlin have done for political philosophy with his Two Concepts of Liberty.
You are very optimistic.
So thank you very much for coming here. And by the way, if you want to register, the website is www.cuhk.edu.hk. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.